So as we proceed now into a discussion of the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 and the details, bear in mind the BND informer, whether or not he was working for the BND or was loaned to the BND by the Jordanian service, this Marwan Krisat, the fact that he is being fingered as the person who made the bomb that brought down Pan Am Flight 103, the fact that he and some compatriots were arrested and then released before the bombing by the West German authorities, and bear in mind also that he works for the PFLP. As we've seen, that is one of the major players on the post-World War II terrorist stage. It is a major player on the Middle Eastern terrorist stage, and it is inextricably linked with François Junot and with the Third Reich alumni who have had such an important role in the events that we are dealing with in the context of the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing. So again, I realize that this is a lot of strange names, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to follow, particularly in the context of the December surprise, a complex scenario in and of itself. By the way, we will continue with the December surprise update next week, as it certainly looks like this is going to go into the next broadcast. Now I'm going to reread the article that I began this broadcast with, this by way of refreshing our information after listening to the dizzying but very important information from Unhealed Wounds. Again, that information is also in a supplement to RFA 22. It's also included in the two-part miscellaneous archive series called The Fascist Third Position. Now, of Marwan Krisat's connections to PFLP and BND, the New York Times writes as follows, this from the New York Times of Tuesday, May 23rd of 1989. A story by Stephen Engelberg. It's headlined, Bonn had contact in group linked to Pan Am bombing. Dateline, Washington, May 22nd. It reads in part as follows. A Jordanian explosives expert who belonged to a terrorist group suspected of bombing a Pan Am jumbo jet last December worked for West German intelligence late last year, American officials said today. Skipping down. The American officials confirmed a report in the West German magazine Stern, which identified the Jordanian as Marwan Krisat. The magazine quoted two high-ranking security officials as saying that Mr. Krisat, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP General Command, made, quote, radio bombs for attacks on planes, quote unquote. A spokesman for the West German intelligence agency was quoted by the Associated Press as denying the story, saying, quote, he has never been an agent for BND and he is not one now, unquote. American officials said the Stern account was accurate, but the precise nature of the relationship between Mr. Krisat and German intelligence could not be learned. Again, skipping down. American officials said the case against the group, that's the PFLP, is strong but circumstantial. They said American intelligence obtained solid information last year that the Popular Front was preparing to attack Americans in retaliation for the downing of an Iranian jetliner over the Persian Gulf. The officials said the group had approached Iranians all over the Middle East, including in Lebanon, volunteering to carry out the operation. Some detailed information about the group's plan was turned over to the West German authorities, who arrested 16 members of the Popular Front last October. 14 members, including Mr. Krisat, were released soon afterward because of what West German officials termed a lack of evidence. In raids on homes of group members, the West German authorities initially found 2 bombs of the type later used to destroy the Pan Am plane. American intelligence officials insisted, however, that there were a total of 5 hidden bombs and urged the Germans to redouble their efforts. This eventually resulted in the discovery this year of 2 additional bombs, one of which exploded and killed 2 German security officials. British officials announced earlier this year that the bomb that blew up the jetliner was hidden in a portable radio and cassette player. The bombs found in the raid on the Popular Front's houses were hidden in Toshiba radio cassette players, according to a security alert distributed by the Federal Aviation Administration. So that's why we're talking about PFLP, François Junot, etc., because, again, it's not at all surprising to find someone hooked up with BND and the PFLP being fingered as the culprit for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. As I said back in January of 1989, the facts suggest that Galen Wackel-related elements of our own national security establishment were in all probability involved in an executive capacity with perpetrating this particular outrage. Information again pointing to curiously shoddy security. Now, bear in mind that the U.S. had advance warning, as indicated in that article, of the fact that PFLP was planning to blow up a Pan Am flight originating in Frankfurt in December of 1988. Bear in mind that that warning was not apparently passed on to everybody, and it's worth noting, too, that the security around Pan Am Flight 103 was surprisingly lax. Bear in mind that the BND informer that is being fingered as the fellow who made the bomb that blew up the plane was arrested along with some compatriots by the Germans in October of 1988. They were then released and apparently went on to blow up the plane, at least if the account floated there can be believed. It's also curious to note the remarkably lax security that surrounded Pan Am Flight 103. Research credit on the following article goes to a listener. This is from the Arizona Republic of Tuesday, January 3rd of 1989, and it points to some remarkably lax security vis-a-vis the baggage on Pan Am Flight 103. Again, from the Arizona Republic, 1389, this is headline, Unchecked Cargo Put on Doomed Jet. Subheaded, West German Officials Admit Lax Security. West German authorities disclosed Monday that some freight was loaded onto doomed Pan Am Flight 103 without being checked, and searchers in Scotland recovered part of the tail section of the Boeing 747. Meanwhile, a Canadian team that helped investigate the 1985 bombing of an Air India airliner joined the probe into the disaster. A spokesman for the West German Federal Prosecutor's Office in Frankfurt, where Flight 103 originated with a smaller plane December 21st, said Monday that investigators have found that freight, including 4 bags of U.S. military mail, was loaded onto the plane without security checks. That last sentence. A spokesman for the West German Federal Prosecutor's Office in Frankfurt, where Flight 103 originated with a smaller plane December 21st, said Monday that investigators have found that freight, including 4 bags of U.S. military mail, was loaded onto the plane without security checks. The spokesman, Hubert Harth, H-A-R-T-H, said the freight was put on a Pan Am 727 that flew the first leg of Flight 103 from Frankfurt. In London, the cargo was transferred to the ill-fated Boeing 747, on which Flight 103 continued, again without a security check. He added, however, that the mail bags were, quote, constantly guarded by U.S. military personnel, unquote. The West German weekly Bunte said Monday that a document box from manufacturer's Hanover Trust also was loaded in Frankfurt and transferred in London without being checked. Well, again, with these dire warnings, which turned out to be accurate, it's strange that any cargo would not have been checked, particularly 4 bags of U.S. military mail. Again, whether or not there's any significance to that remains to be seen, but it's certainly interesting, and it may be very significant. Food for thought and grounds for further research. Into that same category goes the following story, and again, research credit on this goes to a listener. This is from the New Statesman. It's a British publication, and specifically this is an article called Explosive Material, written by a New Statesman staff writer. It's called the New. This is, by the way, the full title. Well, actually, it's called the New Statesman, but I guess it's called the New Statesman and Society. I've always known it as the New Statesman, but in any event, this is the New Statesman from February 10th of 1989, Volume 2, Number 36. And there's an article called Explosive Material, subheaded, Did the bomb that brought down Flight 103 over Lockerbie contain not Semtex but a CIA explosive? David Korn, C-O-R-N, investigates. And the article reads in part as follows. A week after a Boeing 747 aircraft exploded and fell to the Scottish countryside around Lockerbie, British investigators announced that the explosion was, quote, consistent with high-performance explosive, unquote. Although the authorities have refused to release any technical details beyond this cryptic phase, suspicion has fallen on the Soviet bloc explosive Semtex, S-E-M-T-E-X. In recent days, a theory has emerged that the bomb was planted in the luggage of a CIA agent traveling from Beirut to New York via London. But it is also possible that it was not Semtex, but an American plastic explosive originally belonging to the CIA that downed Flight 103. In 1977, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi acquired 40,000 pounds of this explosive known as C4. It was sold to him by a renegade CIA operative, Edwin Wilson. Skipping down, a large portion of the C4 Wilson sold to Gaddafi was improperly stored and it degraded, but a substantial amount was distributed by Gaddafi to others with violent intent. Wilson was eventually tracked down and put behind bars by E. Lawrence Barcella, Jr., a former assistant U.S. attorney. Barcella, now a lawyer in private practice, fears that some of this C4 may have reached the hands of those responsible for destroying Flight 103. He is waiting to see if the investigators announce what brand of plastic explosive was detonated once the chemical analysis is completed. If C4 was used, the Wilson specter would be raised. If Semtex, then the Soviet Union would be embarrassed and détente muddied. There is precedent for official silence on this question, according to Peter Maas, who chronicled Wilson's exploits in his book Manhunt. On April 2, 1986, 9 days after U.S. and Libyan jets clashed over the Gulf of Sidra, four people were killed and 9 injured when a bomb detonated on a TWA flight. A Palestinian group, the Arab Revolutionary Cells, claimed credit for the action. Subsequent news reports cited an FBI finding that the bomb had been made up of about 1 pound of plastic explosives, but what kind was not specified. Maas said that after he finished his book, agents of the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms told him privately it was C4. If C4 did down Flight 103 and Wilson was the original supplier, it may not be the only instance of a U.S. intelligence operative abetting a major air disaster. In a little-noticed testimony before a Senate subcommittee last summer, Franklin Joseph Camper, who ran a private school for mercenaries in Alabama, tied the 1985 air crash of an Air India jetliner to a member of his staff and graduates of his academy, and to C4. Camper, whose business trained Americans and foreigners in assassination and bombing techniques, including the use of plastic explosives, was an informer and sometime operative for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the FBI, and Army intelligence. He also, by the way, figured prominently in Radio Free America number 13, the 4th broadcast in a 4-part Radio Free America series dealing with the Aryan nations. Now again, although the official version is that it was Semtex that brought the plane down, it's worth noting that there was some discussion that this might have been C4. It's even possible that the Semtex account is an official lie, because there has certainly been a lot of official dissembling vis-a-vis PamAm Flight 103. It's also worth noting here that there have been accounts that the bomb was in the luggage of a CIA operative. Whether that was one of the intelligence counter-terrorist officials that died in the bombing remains to be seen. Obviously, this is just an account as yet unconfirmed, but it certainly is interesting. Now, the type of fuse that was used to detonate the bomb on PamAm Flight 103 was a type of fuse that was given to Gaddafi by Edwin Wilson. So Edwin Wilson's specter does loom over this crash. And again, that was in the original December surprise broadcast. Obviously, it was Edwin Wilson's group that trained and armed Gaddafi's terrorist cadre, and Gaddafi is quite close to Abu Nidal, the person who was originally fingered as the probable culprit in this particular bombing. And again, we took a look at Gaddafi's connections to the Skorzeny and Third Reich-related terrorist milieu that we've talked about. We've looked at that earlier in this broadcast. We also looked at that in a big way in Radio Free America shows 4 and 22. We came back to that in a big way in RFAs number 30 and 32 as well. Again, it was in 1985 and 1986 when Amiram Nir and Oliver North were cooperating on joint U.S.-Israeli counter-terror policy that Abu Abbas and his organization that were heavily involved in terrorist acts on the international stage. The Achille Lauro hijacking was performed by Abu Abbas's organization. Again, Abu Abbas tied to Mansour al-Qassar, who was getting the weapons for Oliver North from the Area deal, even though Abu Nidal, another associate of Mansour al-Qassar's, was being fingered as, or at least cited by Oliver North as conspiring against Oliver North. And again, contacts between the American ultra-right and ultra-right elements of the U.S. national security establishment and the very terrorist elements which they are supposedly defending us against suggests very strongly a scenario of provocation. And again, Ottfried Hepp, the member of the Hoffman Group, a member of the European neo-fascist group that is associated with some of these same organizations. Ottfried Hepp, of course, is a member of the very same fascist. He's a player on the fascist third position stage that we looked at the conclusion of Unhealed Wounds by Erna Paris. And so again, the continuity between the Third Reich and the Skorzeny-Galen-Janou contingent in the Middle East in the mid-1950s their connections with contemporary Middle Eastern terrorism and the fascist third position, and the link-ups between Middle Eastern terrorism and the so-called secret team, the group that on this program we've referred to as the Turple-Wilson operation, their connections, of course, to this country's national security establishment and to George Bush, the Iran-Contra scandal. That is the basic outline that we're looking at here. Now, the many funky details, the many apparent cover-ups by the national security establishment and official U.S. officialdom, I should say, in this context, they have the glitches in the U.S. investigation have elicited a lot of criticism of the United States. In particular, there was a lawsuit pending by friends and relatives of the victims of Pan Am Flight 103. An article about that lawsuit appeared in the San Jose Mercury News of Tuesday, July 11th of 1989. This article comes from the Dallas Morning News. It's Dateline New York City and headline, "The Bitter Aftermath of Flight 103's Crash." And it reads in part as follows. Deep grief has turned to anger and bitterness for many families. Let me start again. Deep grief has turned to anger and bitterness for many families of the dead from Pan American World Airways Flight 103, the 747 that exploded over Scotland in December. Frustrated by what they see as official inaction and incompetence, nearly 500 relatives have banded together in a group they call Victims of Pan Am 103. The group has held rallies, lobbied Congress, pored over federal documents, and peppered agency officials with letters. In the 6 months since the crash, Victims of Pan Am 103 has made itself into a public force. Skipping down. We've learned how to be lied to, said Stan Maslowski, whose 30-year-old daughter Diane died in the blast. We've learned that they speak out of both sides of their mouths. It's a shame because I looked up to these people, unquote. They're doing nothing, unquote, said Florence Bissett, who lost her 21-year-old son, Kenneth. They must be hiding something. They have to be hiding something, unquote. Officials from the White House, State Department, and Transportation Department have defended their actions as proper, prudent, and responsive. Few on the other side are convinced. It's like dealing with the enemy, said Hudson's wife, Eleanor. Many family members say their problems with the government began shortly after Pan Am 103 exploded on December 21st, killing all 259 people aboard, and have continued since. Those who went to Lockerbie soon after the crash found a vacuum of information and no one from the State Department to assist them, they said. Those who stayed in the United States fared little better. Vicky Cummock, C-U-M-M-O-C-K, of Coral Gables, Florida, sought any available details, such as time of the crash, place, cause, and passenger list from the State Department by phone. Her husband John had been aboard the flight. She encountered only recorded messages or indifference, she said. And again, for those who feel that, in fact, the government did do everything that they might have done, bear in mind not only the fact that they had advance warning that PFLP was going to try and bomb a plane out of Frankfurt, a Pan Am plane out of Frankfurt in December of 1988, then compare the lax treatment of the luggage, if indeed laxness was what it was responsible there. My personal opinion is that it was a deliberate oversight. I think Pan Am Flight 103 had been targeted for destruction by the very elements in this country that were professing to investigate that very crime. Now, something that should be borne in mind as we review, or as we ponder the remarks of some of the relatives of the victims of Pan Am Flight 103, in particular, Eleanor Hudson here, who said, it's like dealing with the enemy. Well, indeed, the major historical lesson of studying this country's political assassinations, the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, and others, is that in the early 1960s, by 1963, the U.S. national security establishment had begun using deadly force in covert operations in the United States and on American citizens, the same kind of deadly force that had been used in covert operations abroad prior to that point in time. And again, obviously, we cannot bring any of those assassinated officials to life. We cannot undo the historical events of the time. It is important, vitally important, to study this country's political assassinations in order to understand, again, that by the early 60s and ever since then, The very same national security establishment which we read about overthrowing governments abroad, the CIA overthrowing governments in Latin America and elsewhere, well, they've been doing it in this country too, and the legacy of these events is what those people, what those outraged American citizens were citing in that particular article. That's why Americans are being treated, quote, like the enemy, unquote. And again, it's worth noting here, and we've dealt with this in the past, that in January of 1983, the Reagan administration began employing national security psychological warfare veterans in order to manipulate American press coverage in such a way as to affect American popular opinion in a positive direction vis-a-vis Reagan administration national security policy. We're going to review this information about the setting up of this special psychological warfare unit, again, basically to employ the same kinds of techniques on the American population that are used in covert operations. We're going to read from a book called October Surprise, authored by Barbara Honegger, a Reagan administration staffer who is talking about the apparent deal between the Reagan campaign and George Bush and the Khomeini government in Iran. This with regard to the U.S. hostages taken from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. There is abundant evidence, and it's set forth in this book and elsewhere, that the Reagan campaign worked out a deal with Khomeini to hold on to the U.S. hostages until after Jimmy Carter's election defeat was assured, and in exchange for this, the weapons were being transferred to the Iranians for their war against Iraq. Eventually, the proceeds from that, of course, diverted to support the Contras. Of the setting up of a psychological warfare unit to manage the news for the American people, Barbara Honegger writes in the October Surprise, and this is copyright 1988 by Tudor Press. And Barbara writes as follows. In the fall of 1988 issue of the prestigious journal Foreign Policy, Newsweek reporter Robert Parry, P-A-R-R-Y, and Peter Kornbluh, K-O-R-N-B-L-U-H, of the Independent National Security Archive, revealed that psychological warfare experts from the U.S. military, specialists trained in deceiving and confusing an enemy population in time of war or preparation for war, had been brought onto the staff of the National Security Council in an operation headed by a senior CIA disinformation expert recommended by Vice President Bush's National Security Advisor, Donald Gregg. In 1982, Gregg, who, if reports about his involvement in the pre-1980 election Paris meetings are correct, had much to divert media attention from, recommended Walter Raymond, Jr., a CIA psychological warfare veteran, to head what was euphemistically called the Office of Public Diplomacy, unquote. The mission of this office was to ensure that Congress, the press, and the American public did not get too close to the truth about the administration's covert Iran and Contra operations. In January of 1983, President Reagan formalized this psychological warfare offensive against the American public in National Security Decision Directive NSDD number 77. A few months later, in July of 1983, the National Security Council also took over a second public diplomacy office in the U.S. State Department, headed by an Otto Reich. Reich had acknowledged in a memo that his State Department operations, quote, responded to NSC White House direction, unquote. Under Reich at the State Department were U.S. Army psychological warfare specialists, including his executive assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Jacobowitz, and 5 experts from the Army's 4th Psychological Operations Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a key training center for military covert operations. This State Department office, under White House direction, orchestrated the publication of articles in the nation's newspapers that purported to be written by independent scholars. According to one report by the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, the investigative arm of Congress, the public diplomacy program amounted, quote, to a legally prohibited covert propaganda campaign designed to influence the U.S. media and the public, unquote. In these efforts, Donald Gregg and Walt Raymond, Jr. were certain to have the enthusiastic support of Vice President George Bush, who himself had a history of influencing with the U.S. press. In the wake of the Watergate scandal, Mr. Bush, as President Gerald Ford's CIA director, met personally with editors of the nation's major newspapers and news magazines, gently pressuring them not to print information embarrassing to the Republican administration, in the alleged interest, of course, of national security, quote unquote. By the mid-1980s, according to Los Angeles Times reporter Doyle McManus, Most of these so-called public relations operations directed from both the White House and the Department of State were devoted, quote, not to selling the administration's programs, but to deceiving the public about the nature of those programs, unquote. A senior NSC official acknowledged that the public diplomacy apparatus was modeled after CIA covert operations aimed at enemy populations overseas. Quote, they were trying to manipulate public opinion using the tools of Walt Raymond's tradecraft, which he learned from his career in the CIA covert operations shop, he said. NSC advisor John Poindexter himself told Oliver North in a message dated September 13, 1986, quote, what he, CIA Director William Casey, has in mind as a person to head up the psychological offense operation is a political operative who can twist arms and also run a high-powered public relations campaign. According to Foreign Policy, NSC and State Department public diplomacy head Walt Raymond Jr. and his staff pressured journalists and editors in both reporting and not reporting information about the administration's Iran operations to suit its own goals. Clearly, chief among these goals was the election of Vice President George Bush in 1988. With the psychological warfare operation already in place, it could easily be activated to advance a purely domestic political agenda. The existence of this psychological warfare and propaganda office was so secret and so sensitive that the existence of the psychological warfare and propaganda offices was so secret and so sensitive that a chapter on their history and operations was censored by Reagan-Bush loyalists from the final report of the Congressional Iran-Contra Committee. This suppressed chapter concluded that, quote, the propaganda office did what a covert CIA operation in a foreign country might do, attempt to manipulate the media, the Congress, and public opinion to support Reagan administration policies. The problem with all this is they tried to do it in America to their own people, to their own Congress, and to their own free press, unquote. That basically is why these people, the bereaved relatives of the victims of Pan Am Flight 103, are being treated, quote, like the enemy, quote, unquote. Because to the people running this country, and in all probability to the people who precipitated that bombing from this country, they are the enemy, quote, unquote. Well, basically that winds things up for this evening. The conclusion of the December surprise update will be carried over to next week. And again, this will be grafted together for archival purposes. A couple of programming notes. First of all, again, on Tuesday, October 24th, on sister station KKUP FM at 91.5 on the FM dial, Radio Free America program number 19, a broadcast which will intersect with considerable elements of tonight's program as well. There are a lot of elements in common. Radio Free America program number 19, the third broadcast in a 5-part Radio Free America series dealing with the shooting of Pope John Paul II in May of 1981. RFA 19, the second broadcast in a 2-part sub-series, actually the second of 2 broadcasts in that series, dealing exclusively with the P2 Lodge. Now, for people, we had a couple of people calling to request the address for archives on audio. Anybody who would like to secure master copies or would like to secure copies of any of the archive shows, master copies of all of the archive shows are on permanent file with a tape duplication service. Again, tonight's broadcast will go into the archives as a supplement to the December surprise broadcast, now RFA number 35. I will continue with the December surprise update next week. Archives on audio, again, if you would like to get if you miss a One Step Beyond show and would like to get it, One Step Beyond shows are on temporary file with Archives on Audio. Now, the address is Archives on Audio, Box 170023, Box 170023. That's in San Francisco, zip code 94117, 94117-0023. The phone number is area code 415-346-1840, 415-346-1840. Again, that's Archives on Audio, Box 170023, San Francisco, California, 94117, 94117-0023. Phone 415-346-1840. 415-346-1840. write or phone to the attention of Paul, and again, neither myself nor this station makes money out of this arrangement. That concludes things for me for this evening. Stay tuned now for Belladonna, and she will be playing you a variety of different sounds. Do what you can. Get out the word on the drug tug Lenvest case. Don't give up hope on that. Keep busy, and again, I will see you next week. We will finish up the December surprise update next week. Thanks for listening, and God bless. PamAm bombing, Dateline, Washington, May 22nd. It reads in part as follows. A Jordanian explosives expert who belonged to a terrorist group suspected of bombing a PamAm jumbo jet last December worked for West German intelligence late last year, American officials said today. Skipping down. The American officials confirmed a report in the West German magazine Stern, which identified the Jordanian as Marwan Krisat. The magazine quoted two high-ranking security officials as saying that Mr. Krisat, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP General Command, made, quote, radio bombs for attacks on planes, quote unquote. A spokesman for the West German intelligence agency was quoted by the Associated Press as denying the story, saying, quote, he has never been an agent for BND and he is not one now, unquote. American officials said the Stern account was accurate, but the precise nature of the relationship between Mr. Krisat, this is a lot of strange names, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to follow, particularly in the context of the December surprise, a complex scenario in and of itself. By the way, we will continue with the December surprise update next week, as it certainly looks like this is going to go into the next broadcast. Now, I'm going to reread the article that I began this broadcast with, this by way of refreshing our information after listening to the dizzying but very important information from Unhealed Wounds. Again, that information is also in a supplement to RFA 22. It's also included in the two-part miscellaneous archive series called The Fascist Third Position. Now, of Marwan Krisat's connections to PFLP and BND, the New York Times writes as follows, this from the New York Times of Tuesday, May 23rd of 1989. A story by Stephen Engelberg. Its headline, Bonn had contact in group linked to Bat and German intelligence could not be learned. Again, skipping down. American officials said the case against the group, that's the PFLP, is strong but circumstantial. They said American intelligence obtained solid information last year that the Popular Front was preparing to attack Americans in retaliation for the downing of an Iranian jetliner over the Persian Gulf. The officials said the group had approached Iranians all over the Middle East, including in Lebanon, volunteering to carry out the operation. Some detailed information about the group's plan was turned over to the West German authorities, who arrested 16 members of the Popular Front last October. 14 members, including Mr. Krisat, were released soon afterward because of what West German officials termed a lack of evidence. In raids on homes of group members, the West German authorities initially found 2 bombs of the type later used to destroy the PamAm plane. American intelligence officials insisted, however, that they were a total. So as we proceed now into a discussion of the bombing of PamAm Flight 103 and the details, bear in mind the BND informer, whether or not he was working for the BND or was loaned to the BND by the Jordanian service, this Marwan Krisat, the fact that he is being fingered as the person who made the bomb that brought down PamAm Flight 103, the fact that he and some compatriots were arrested and then released before the bombing by the West German authorities, and bear in mind also that he works for the PFLP. As we've seen, that is one of the major players on the post-World War II terrorist stage. It is a major player on the Middle Eastern terrorist stage, and it is inextricably linked with Francois Jeannot and with the Third Reich alumni who have had such an important role in the events that we are dealing with in the context of the PamAm Flight 103 bombing. So again, I realize a total of 5 hidden bombs and urged the Germans to redouble their efforts. This eventually resulted in the discovery this year of 2 additional bombs, one of which exploded and killed 2 German security officials. British officials announced earlier this year that the bomb that blew up the jetliner was hidden in a portable radio and cassette player. The bombs found in the raid on the Popular Front's houses were hidden in Toshiba radio cassette players, according to a security alert distributed by the Federal Aviation Administration. So that's why we're talking about PFLP, Francois Genoux, etc., because, again, it's not at all surprising to find someone hooked up with BND and the PFLP being fingered as the culprit for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. As I said back in January of 1989, the facts suggest that Galen Wackel-related elements of our own national security establishment were, in all probability,